This video will cover the human pleura. Hello everyone, this is Shireen Hafiz and let's get started. We are going to discuss the pleura, the parts of the pleural sac, and we're going to discuss pleural cavities and lines of pleural reflection, and then we end with a discussion on the basis of thoracocentesis. So I'm going to start the discussion by asking you, what is pleura to begin with? So pleura is a serous membrane. It's one of the three serous membranes that we have in the body. 1, 2, 3. Pleura, peritoneum, and pericardium. We're going to focus in this video on the pleura. So pleura is the serous membrane that lines the thoracic cavity. The parietal pleura, that's the part of the pleura that lines the thoracic wall. So the word parietal refers to the wall. And then visceral pleura, that's the part of the pleura that covers the lung. And put in mind that parietal and visceral pleura is continuous. It forms a continuous sheet that form a pleural sac. The space between the parietal and visceral pleura is your pleural cavity. So what is pleural cavity? It is the potential space between the visceral and parietal pleura. And I would pay attention to the word potential here because it's not a real space. So in living human, the pleural cavity is not a real space. It's just a potential space that has small amount of serous fluid for lubrication. It does not have any organs. It just has a small amount of serous fluid. So let's discuss in details the parts of the pleura. So we have pulmonary pleura, or the other name for it, visceral pleura, that again covers the lung. And then we have parietal pleura, and that's the one that lines the wall. We can subdivide that parietal pleura into parts, and we name those parts based on what it lines. So we have costal parietal pleura. That's the part of the pleura that lines the ribs and costal cartilages and intercostal muscles. The diaphragmatic parietal pleura, that's the part that lines the diaphragm. And mediastinal parietal pleura, that's the part that lines the mediastinum. And in a second, I'm going to discuss what is mediastinum. Then we have cervical parietal pleura. That's really the part of the pleura that extends superior to the first lip, superior to the superior thoracic aperture. It extends into the neck. That's why we call it cervical pleura, and it looks like a cup. That's why it's called pleural copula. So let's get your attention to that image in here. So I'm going to draw your attention first to that side of the image. So what's in the middle here is your lung. So I would look at that orange line in here. That's beginning here, and I'm not going to continue the rest not to mess up the picture, the original one. So look at this orange line and trace it. That part of the pleura that covers the lung, that's visceral pleura or pulmonary pleura. If you go to the anatomy laboratory and try to separate that visceral pleura or the pulmonary pleura from the lung, you will not be able to physically separate it from the lung. It's just intimately in contact of the surface of the lung, and it will appear as like a shiny surface. That's your visceral pleura. If you now look at that blue line, see this one? Oh, sorry. if you look at that blue line and trace it, this is the part of the pleura that lines the ribs and intercostal muscles. See down here how that blue line really continuous with the green part. So this is where that costal parietal pleura reflects and continue on the diaphragm down here as diaphragmatic parietal pleura. And then we're going to continue tracing that green line where it turns into that purple one. This is the part of the pleura that lines the mediastinum, which is that space in here, and I will discuss it in a second. So that part of the pleura is the mediastinal pleura. See, trace that purple line again, it will take you back. Oh, again, it will take you back to that visceral pleura. Then look up here what happens. That costal pleura, the blue line, will continue above the level of the lung. That part is actually above the level of the first rib, above the level of the superior thoracic aperture. That's your copula pleura. And see how it looks like a cup? That's why it's called copula pleura. So what is showing here on that other side of the image? This shows actually how the lung grew into the pleural sac. So during development, the pleural sac is formed first, and then the lung grows into that pleural sac, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and to the extent that it would leave no space between that part of the pleura that covers the lung and the other part of the pleura that covers the walls, the parietal pleura. So basically, it's like you're wearing a glove on your hand. Your hand would be your lung, and the gloves would be the visceral pleura. And the lung is keeping pushing and growing into that pleural sac until it fills the space, and all what would be left is that potential space between the visceral pleura that covers the lung and the parietal pleura that covers the wall. Okay, so that pleural cavity again is a potential space. It's not a real space, and the pleural cavity forms around both lungs. So we have one pleural sac that encloses your right lung, and then we have another pleural sac, the left one, that encloses your left lung. And that space within that pleural sac between the visceral and parietal pleura is your pleural cavity. And that is what's showing in here. That space here, that's your pleural cavity. Okay, so now what is mediastinum? So we understand so far that we have a pleural sac on the right. That's the sac that encloses the lung. So that's, let's say, right pleural sac. And here is the left pleural sac that encloses the left lung. And I would really pay attention here, not to say that the lung is inside the sac. The lung is not inside the sac. The lung is enclosed by this pleural sac. So we have right pleural sac and we have a left pleural sac. Again, inside that right pleural sac, we have a pleural cavity. We have and inside that left pleural sac, we have the left pleural cavity. Between these two pleural sacs, the right one and left one, there is a space. That's vertical space here between the right and left pleural sacs is called the mediastinum. So mediastinum is that the space between the right and left pleural sacs. It extends vertically from the superior thoracic aperture to the level of the diaphragm, and it is lined with that part of the pleura, the mediastinum pleura. Okay, so if we think further about the mediastinum, that is space between the two pleural sacs, we can further divide that mediastinum into a superior mediastinum. That's the part of the mediastinum that's superior to your sternal angle, and then inferior mediastinum, that's the part that's inferior to the sternal angle. That mediastinum can be further divided into anterior and middle and posterior, basically based on the location of the heart inside the mediastinum. So the anterior mediastinum is that part of the mediastinum that's anterior to the heart. Where the heart is your middle mediastinum, and then posterior to the heart is your posterior mediastinum. Okay, we'll go with the mediastinum. So let's talk about lines of pleural reflection. So we said that we have parts of the pleura. We have parts of the parietal pleura that we name based on the part that it lines. At certain location, some of these parts of the parietal pleura will reflect to change or to cover or to line another part of the thoracic wall and changes the name based on that. So as a result, the pleura will bend at different, of course, levels and produce these lines of pleural reflection. So we have the sternal line of pleural reflection. That's where the costal pleura reflects to become mediastinal pleura, and that line, because it's called sternal line, so you have to think that it relates to the sternum somehow. That line of pleural reflection, the sternal lines of pleural reflection, presents anteriorly posterior to the sternum. Then we have vertebral lines of pleural reflection. Basically, it's the same thing like the sternal ones, but on the posterior side at the level of the vertebrae. So that's where the costal parietal pleura reflects to become mediastinal pleura posteriorly. So this one and this one they're very similar, just one happens anteriorly and the other one happens posteriorly. Then we have this one, the big one, the costal lines of pleural reflection. That happens when the costal parietal pleura reflects inferiorly to become the diaphragmatic parietal pleura, and that of course happens inferiorly when the ribs meet the diaphragm. And let's see those on pictures. So on this picture, if you follow here the right and left sternal lines of pleural reflection, that's anteriorly, that's all of these, all of that would be costal parietal pleura, and then at that level, that costal parietal pleura will reflect to become mediastinal parietal pleura, and it forms these sternal lines of pleural reflection. And of course, since we have a pleural sac on the right side, another pleural sac on the left side. We have a right and left sternal lines of pleural reflection. Then posteriorly, the same thing happens, but at the level of the vertebrae. That's where that costal parietal pleura reflects to become mediastinal pleura, but posteriorly at the level of vertebrae. Then that one in here, it shows that this one, it shows, and here is the right one. The same thing, it's just here the right one, and here is the left one. That is your costal line of pleural reflection. So again, that happens when that costal parietal pleura inferiorly reflects here two lines, the diaphragm. That is the one that we're going to focus on. So when those lines of pleural reflection reflect, they leave a space. Again, a potential space between that part of the parietal pleura with another part of parietal pleura. We have one that's called costo-mediastinal recess. That's the potential space between the parietal mediastinal pleura and the parietal costal pleura. We're going to ignore this one. I am going to focus on this one, the costodiaphragmatic recess. That is the potential space between the parietal diaphragmatic pleura and the parietal costal pleura. Basically, that occurs when that parietal costal pleura reflects to become the diaphragmatic, and at that space where it reflects to become the diaphragmatic, it leaves a potential space, the costodiaphragmatic recess. And that's what's showing in here. That space is your costodiaphragmatic recess. That's where the costal parietal pleura reflects to become diaphragmatic, and as a result of that reflection, it leaves that potential space, the costodiaphragmatic recess. Why is this one significant? Because, one, it is part of the pleural cavity. Don't forget that. It's between two parts of the pleura, so it is part of the pleural cavity. It is, in a matter of fact, the most inferior part of the pleural cavity, which tells you if you have fluid, pathological of course, accumulates in the pleural cavity and making it a real space, which is badness, that's in pathology, that the fluid will accumulate in that costodiaphragmatic recess in a standing patient by simply enough by gravity. So that costodiaphragmatic recess is a perfect place to collect pleural fluids if we want to, or a perfect place to aspirate pleural fluids that's accumulated in the pleural cavity. And why is it also advantageous? If you look at the extent of the lung, that costodiaphragmatic recess is inferior to the inferior-most extent of the lung. So in a standing patient, if you go to that costodiaphragmatic recess, you are able to withdraw fluid, pleural fluid that's accumulated here by gravity without puncturing the lung, which of course we don't want to do. So in case of thoracocentesis, which basically is the process of insertion of a needle through the chest wall into the pleural cavity, usually to remove fluid that's accumulated there because it's not good to have fluid accumulated there. Normally, this space again is a potential space and it shouldn't have fluid, all for therapeutic purposes or again diagnostic purposes to collect some of that pleural fluid. So that thoracocentesis, the process of inserting a needle, it's done in that costodiaphragmatic recess, again because it's a safe space. That's where the fluid accumulates by gravity, and also it's relatively safe space. So an example in case of hemothorax, if there is internal bleeding that happens and there is accumulation of pleural fluids, that's where it accumulates, and that's where you do your thoracocentesis for accumulation of fluid in a standing patient in that costodiaphragmatic recess. That's where the fluid will